Rand Paul just reignited the COVID origins firestorm, and this time, the accusations go straight to Dr. Anthony Fauci. In a tense exchange, a whistleblower claimed CIA scientists leaned toward the lab leak theory early on, before intelligence assessments suddenly shifted. What happened behind closed doors has lawmakers demanding answers.
Is it your testimony that there is still resistance from the CIA to comply with the law we passed to declassify all the COVID information?
Yes.
One of the things that I think is new today that I'm hearing from your testimony is that from an early period of time, you believe, and the information you're aware of, is that CIA scientists from an early time after the pandemic began, 2020, 2021, were concluding that the lab leak was the most likely hypothesis?
Yes, Senator. I'd like to offer some qualifications on that as well. A lot of the issues occurred at the interagency space, at the National Intelligence Council, the individuals responsible for conducting or writing WMD analysis. So, and many of those individuals are on JDA from the CIA. But yes, very early, as early as 2020, there were agencies within the IC circulating papers that that said, hey, there's, for example, DOE circulated a paper in May of 2020 that said that all the conditions were present for a lab leak. And I could go through the timeline, but yes, my short answer is yes, periodically throughout 2020 all the way to 2024. Yes.
I think the arguments, pro and con for what is the evidence on whether this came from a lab or came from nature are still important. So for years, we've been asking the CIA to produce the scientists, either in a classified setting or a public setting, to discuss the arguments. I don't see any reason why the argument should be classified. One of the arguments that's made publicly is that the source looks like it came from a single source of RNA, not like 5 different types of viruses or 20 different types like you had with SARS 2003, but it came from one source. And virtually everybody argues that sort of indicates a lab and not a nature. And so those arguments are important scientific arguments to have, but we've been prevented from having them. We've been preventing from getting all of the declassified information. But what I think is of importance that's new today is that your testimony is that the CIA scientists were concluding that it was lab, but then with this, there was a 90-day study in 2021, and this study was done by NIC, led by NIC. Tell us what NIC is again.
It's the National Intelligence Council, and individuals responsible for writing various WMD and bio-related issues led that.
So when they had this study, they had CIA scientists telling them, look, the scientific evidence looks like it came from the lab, but then they brought in Anthony Fauci. And is it your opinion that Anthony Fauci was able to overrule the scientist or get NIC to conclude somehow that there wasn't a conclusion to be had here, we're going to be neutral, contradicting what the scientists were telling them?
So there's 2 questions there, and I want to break them up into 2. One is, where were the injection points, Dr. Anthony Fauci? Where did Dr. Anthony Fauci and when did he inject himself into the IC? And the other half of that question, if I'm, and I don't want to extrapolate too much here, is okay, what happened with why was there a change in analysis? So I'll start with if it's okay, Dr. Paul.
Sure.
Senator, I'll start with Dr. Anthony Fauci. There were 2 instances. On 3 February 2020 and 4 June 2021, Anthony Fauci had contact with the interagency. And how to sort of broadly generalize this is that contact was happily pursued within the IC. They wanted that contact. And he provided a curated list of subject matter experts, which coincidentally wrote the proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2. So it's not like he came in and said, you have to do X, Y, and Z. He provided recommendations. It's when you look at what has already been publicly released about Dr. Fauci, and then what you're seeing under the curtain at the IC, where you realize, okay, there is a narrative that was being generated by his contact, not just with experts here in the United States, but experts in Australia and the UK. And that's the public-facing piece. And he had tried to sort of keep his hands clear of, hey, I didn't have anything to do with the proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2. But in the meantime, he's pushing those authors and individuals that have been in his orbit into the IC as experts. And I'll jump to June 2021. We as the IC at the NIC happily pursued those recommendations. And in one email, which I'll describe to you, the person in charge of leading the 90-day study, he introduced himself to the community that on what they were supposed to be doing, and then the community said, listen, we've got these people we should be talking to. And another very senior NIC officer sent a direct email to him saying, hey, considering that Dr. Fauci is a public health expert, are you sure we should be relying on this? Shouldn't we have a separate set? And in this instance, the individual responded, no, in this case, Dr. Anthony Fauci is a subject matter expert. However, that's directly contradicting his public testimony of being a subject matter expert.
Part of the job in intelligence when you interview someone is assessing their truthfulness, their potential biases or conflicts of interest. Did anyone ever bring up that Anthony Fauci approved the research that went on in Wuhan and that it might not be in his interest for the conclusion to be that it came from a lab that he had funded, that there might be a conflict? Did anybody ever bring up that he might not be an objective witness?
That was one example of an email. No one laid it out quite that clearly. You're piecing it together. We were piecing it together from multiple emails, from multiple agencies, multiple documents. It was more subtle than that. Nobody said this is happening, and unfortunately, I think they probably should have. It was all out there.
But your conclusion is that changing from the scientific consensus of it being from a lab to a neutral position by the CIA was significantly influenced by Anthony Fauci? It
was significantly influenced by Anthony Fauci's injecting himself into the IC. And to go to the second part of your question about what happened, particularly during the 90-day study, we have documentation that shows that as of August 12th, the CIA was considering calling this a lab leak, August 12th of 2021. And then that changed on August 17th of 2021. Right. And unfortunately, because the CIA would not provide us documentation that we asked for, we have no idea why that changed. And that's
And they weren't alone, because we know the FBI was coming to the same conclusion that it was lab leak, as well as the FBI.
The hearing quickly escalated when Senator Rand Paul confronted a whistleblower over allegations involving the CIA's handling of COVID-19 origin intelligence. According to the testimony, some intelligence agencies, including scientists connected to the CIA and Department of Energy, were leaning toward the lab leak theory as early as 2020. That alone is significant because, for years, much of the public debate focused on dismissing the lab leak possibility as fringe or unsupported. Now, lawmakers are revisiting whether crucial scientific discussions were intentionally kept out of public view. What made the exchange even more explosive was the whistleblower's claim that Dr. Anthony Fauci inserted himself into the intelligence community's review process during critical moments in 2020 and 2021. The testimony alleged that Fauci recommended a curated list of experts, including figures connected to the well-known proximal origin paper, which strongly argued against the lab leak theory. While the witness stopped short of directly accusing Fauci of ordering conclusions to be changed, the implication was clear: influential voices may have shaped the direction of intelligence assessments behind the scenes. Rand Paul focused heavily on what he described as a sudden shift inside the intelligence community during the 90-day review ordered in 2021. According to the whistleblower, documentation suggested the CIA was considering officially backing the lab leak theory in August of that year, only for that position to reportedly change days later. Paul repeatedly questioned why that reversal happened and whether conflicts of interest were ever seriously examined, especially given Fauci's connection to research funding tied to Wuhan-related projects. The hearing also exposed a broader frustration among lawmakers over transparency. Paul argued that the scientific arguments surrounding the origins of COVID-19 should never have been buried behind classification walls. He pointed to evidence publicly discussed for years, including claims about the virus appearing genetically linked to a single source, as information Americans deserved to openly debate. The whistleblower echoed those concerns, saying investigators inside the intelligence community were piecing together clues from scattered emails and documents without full cooperation from agencies like the CIA. Politically, the hearing guarantees that the COVID origins debate is far from over. For critics of Fauci and the federal response to the pandemic, the testimony will likely reinforce suspicions that information was tightly controlled during a moment of global panic. Supporters, meanwhile, argue that intelligence assessments are often complicated, uncertain, and evolving. But regardless of where people stand, one thing became clear during this hearing: questions surrounding the origins of COVID-19, and the role powerful officials may have played in shaping the narrative, continue to ignite fierce political battles years after the pandemic began.